Hello friends, Patrick here, studying William James. Oh, my book is falling apart here. Pragmatism, a great American philosopher. So they say. Last video we covered lecture 4, which was called The One and the Many, a kind of a straw man argument of creating this dichotomy about the characteristics of the universe, William James. Today, I'm going to try and get through lecture 5, lecture 6. Lecture 5 is called Pragmatism and Common Sense. Lecture 6 is called Pragmatism's Conception of Truth. And lecture 7, Pragmatism and Humanism. So that's going to take us from page 72 to about page 118. Let's try and get through this as quick as we can. How are you doing? I hope you had a blessed day wherever you are, whatever you're doing. I'm going to try and get through this without being too boring, but there might be some encouraging parts. I hope so. Lecture 5, Pragmatism and Common Sense. What notes did I take on this? A lot of what William James is doing is playing with language, playing with etymology. Somebody like this is like trying to listen to somebody that's been educated at Oxford. Their command of the English language is so far beyond what is normally communicated today that it makes it difficult to know what they're even talking about. Between his study of Latin and perhaps his knowledge of other languages and his vast vocabulary, it makes it very difficult to keep up to his level of communication, especially without having a mentor. I'm not studying this in a class where I have a professor to explain to me what William James is trying to say. I have to try and dig through it myself, which makes it very slow slogging. And so to save you time, how am I supposed to be able to distill it and share it with you in a way that makes it bearable and interesting? If you had to listen to this gentleman in person, it would put you to sleep, because what he's communicating is imperceptible to the way that our ears are trained to hear news bites in very, very basic elementary language, small, easy words. He's using big, fancy words, Peter Gabriel, he lets those big, fat words come right out of his big, fat mouth. So it's essentially trying to walk your way through. Imagine you were trying to go somewhere to pick strawberries or pick blueberries. And normally you'd go in a patch, an orchard, and you can easily find your way around and pick the fruit. Maybe an apple orchard, I don't know, it doesn't matter. But imagine you had to do that and it was intermingled with a mess, a whole collection of thistles and thorns and briars and all kinds of other plants that were getting in your way. That's what it's like trying to read through this. So to find little tidbits of truth that you can understand and get the gist of, you're getting caught up in all these brambles that are clinging to you like thorns and thistles, and it's tedious and straight up difficult to get through it. Let's see what he's talking about here. I'm trying to read my own notes. So pragmatism and common sense. He goes and tries to talk about the essence of the lecture is that pragmatism does not want to be committed to a version of truth that is absolute. He talks about people that believe in an absolute truth as realists or monists, and people that see truth as something subjective. He calls them pragmatists or dualists. And you can see the foundation of his philosophy being applied to scientific thought. It comes all the way up to today's thinkers, to today's scientists, to today's physicists. And I couldn't help being reminded of Stephen Krause's work, where he says, the universe doesn't give a damn about you. This comes straight out from the thoughts of William James, saying that there is no absolute. We're just in this big, huge universe that created us. So pragmatism and common sense, he doesn't want to be cold nor hot. He doesn't want to have any absolutes. There's a quote here. He says, common sense is better for one sphere of life, science for another, philosophical criticism for a third. But whether either be true or absolutely, heaven only knows. So he plays around with different definitions, and for him, he can apply his perception of reality different ways at different times. I'm not going to go into much detail on this lecture because it's a slog. Lecture 6 is called Pragmatism's Conception of Truth, and here he continues on. The pragmatist views truth as something that is realized over time. What experience would be different whether such an individual belief is true or false? What effect does it have on the person's experience of reality? And he uses this phrase that he calls cash value. What is the cash value of truth in experiential terms? Pragmatism asks this question. True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. So, by this statement, William James is throwing out anything metaphysical as being false. Anything that's not provable with facts, he considers as false. And his statement is, in and of itself, false. This thesis, he says, is what I have to defend. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. He uses the word stagnant derogatorily there. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true. It is made true by events. Its verity is in fact an event, a process. The process, namely, of its verifying itself is verification, its validity in the process of its validation. And he puts different emphasis on different parts of those words with italics and what have you. And so he has a version of truth that is subjective, flexible, only if it's measurable, and it'll be measurable in different ways at different times. I'm not going to get too bogged down in here. He considers rationalism to be a tirade, he calls it. And he considers something that is true, he says, is only the expedient in our way of thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. So he considers something true only if it's expedient. Just like whatever you do, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. It's not important. It's only whether it's expedient. This is what he calls it. And to back up his argument, he says, Ptolemaic astronomy, Euclidean space, Aristotelian logic, scholastic metaphysics were expedient for centuries, but human experience has boiled over these limits, and now we call these things only relatively true, or true within those old borders of experience. Absolutely, they are false, he says, which is funny he would use that term because he doesn't believe in absolute truth or absolute falseness, but he uses it when it's convenient for himself. He goes on here at the bottom of page 99 in his lecture on the pragmatism conception of truth. The most fateful point of difference between being a rationalist and being a pragmatist is now fully in sight, he says. Experience is in mutation, and our psychological ascertainments of truth are in mutation. So much rationalism will allow, but never that either reality itself or truth itself is mutable. So he contrasts rationalism with being a pragmatist. And he takes some other philosophers' definition of truth and tries to counter them. And he doesn't like rationalism. Rationalism reverts to principles. He says that their definitions of truth are utterly trivial. So he doesn't put any weight on rationalist argument. He says here, neither man nor God should ever ascertain truth. The word would still have to be defined as that which ought to be ascertained and recognized, which in my opinion is a very ignorant statement for him to make. He says, justice is ideal, solely ideal. Reason conceives that it ought to exist, but experience shows that it cannot. Truth, which ought to be, cannot be. Reason is deformed by experience. As soon as reason enters experience, it becomes contrary to reason. These quotes that he pulls from, he says, are from the last philosophic work that I've read. And this type of thinking, this type of attitude is nothing more than nihilism. And he consistently tries to balance one viewpoint against another and maintain a type of balance in between as a pragmatist, but it's not hard to see where his favoritism lies in his discussion, that he favors the idea of there being no absolutes, that he favors the idea of everything being dependent upon something else, depending on particular circumstances and particular definitions of the words that he's using to describe his reality. So let's move on to lecture 7, and this will be the last lecture I cover for today. Tomorrow's video is going to be on pragmatism and religion. That should be interesting. So this lecture 7 is called Pragmatism and Humanism. He said, all great single word answers to the world's riddle, of the world's riddle being, what is the notion of truth? All great single word answers to this riddle, such as God, the one, reason, law, spirit, matter, nature, polarity, the dialectic process, the idea, the self, the oversoul, draw the admiration that men have lavished on them from this oracular role. Oracular. The word means as if coming from an oracle, as if having some great authority, that these single word answers inspire or suggest to the individual. Notice how he puts the answer to truth, the first answer he puts as God. And then he parades a whole list of other definitions for what is truth as just as important or just as equal as that original suggestion that he makes. The one, reason, law, spirit, matter. He places them all at the same level, which makes him ignorant and false out of the gate, in my opinion, from the get-go. He puts the term, the truth, what a perfect idol of the rationalistic mind, and he makes fun of it, right? He makes fun of a young friend of his who sent him a letter that said, in everything in science, art, morals, and religion, there must be one system that is right and every other wrong. So he sets that up as a straw man argument and says, oh, what a laughable statement that is. But his statements are just as laughable. Let's move on. He says here on page 107, they are neither true nor false. They simply are. It is only what we say about them. Only the names we give them, our theories of their source and nature and remote relations. They may be true or not. So for William James, nothing is true and nothing is false. Everything is, it depends. He says even facts. He says we read the same facts differently. Waterloo, as a word, with the same fixed details, spells a victory for an Englishman. For a Frenchman, it spells a defeat. So for an optimist philosopher, the universe spells victory. For a pessimist, defeat. So he uses this simile or metaphor as an analogy for truth, depending on the perspective of the listener. How they interpret the words will be different for each independent human of what their perception of truth is. And he adds another support for his argument by saying that the same thing can be described in many different ways. He uses numbers, for example. He says the number 27, it could be defined as the cube of 3, or as the product of 3 and 9, or as 26 plus 1, or 100 minus 73. So he says there's countless different ways to describe reality. There's countless different ways to describe a statement or an event or a universe or our reality. And because there's many different ways to describe it, then there's no absolute way that is true. And so he tries to build on his argument that there is no absolutes. He gives another example of the constellations. He says there's a constellation in the sky, what we know today, we usually call the Big Dipper. He says some people call it the Great Bear, some people call it Charles Wain, some people calls it the Dipper. And because there's all these different descriptions for it, none of them are true. The alternative between pragmatism and rationalism, in the shape in which we now have it before us, is no longer a question in the theory of knowledge. It concerns the structure of the universe itself. This is a statement that James makes. But really, based on his arguments, it's simply a structure based on his own definitions. So the rival metaphysical hypotheses of pluralism and monism have come back upon us. He returns to this. He says, for the rationalist, the belly band, he calls it, another word for belt, of its universe must be tight. A radical pragmatist, on the other hand, is a happy-go-lucky, anarchistic sort of creature. And now here we get right down into it. This pragmatism and humanism. Listen closely for this next little portion. I'll try and finish as quick as I can. I'm sorry this has been boring, but the book itself is boring. This way you don't have to slog through it. The authority of the state and that of an absolute moral law have resolved themselves into expediencies. And the Holy Church has resolved itself into meeting houses. So he dismisses religion. A universe with such as us contributing to create its truth, a world delivered to our opportunisms and our private judgments. We're no more fit for such a part than the Filipinos are fit for self-government. What a bigoted statement he makes, the colonialism statement at the time that he lived in. He considers the state should have control over the absolute moral law. He's saying here, essentially, that humans and their opportunisms and private judgments are not fit for self-government. Isn't that interesting? A guy that was considered a great American philosopher, and he considered that humans were not fit for self-government. He said, such a world would not be respectable philosophically. He calls it a dog without a collar. So his view of humanity is very bad, is very poor. And this has carried forward into atheistic thinking to today. It's just that he was able to say it more eloquently and hide his true intentions through wordplay. And he brings out this argument between the tough-minded and the weak-minded. Notice what he says here. The tough-minded are the men whose alpha and omega are facts. And he considers the weak-minded are moved to this place he calls a piece of perverse abstraction, worship. Do you see that? That's when his true colors finally start to come out. Between all his esoteric discussion and all his flowery language and all his far-reaching arguments about definitions and word terms and his ideas of truth and how to measure truth and how to measure reality and how to... This is finally what he starts to reach a conclusion. He comes to the final conclusion. There is nothing. Right? And he says, the tough-minded are the men whose alpha and omega are facts. So he obviously considered himself to be tough-minded. He didn't put any stock into the metaphysical. He gives a quote here that I was going to read, and talking about the definition of winter and how it covers a lot of communication in a single word. And it's essentially poetry, the writing that he's doing at the bottom of page 116. A couple of paragraphs of poetry, but it's going to take me too long and I'm going to go past my time on the video, so I'm going to have to leave that out. But just to not totally slag the guy, I have to give an appreciation for his word ability is beyond anything I'd ever have the capability to aspire to, unless I had another lifetime to read and study or to have his background in learning languages and grammar and Latin and so on and so forth. So he goes on to say, some people have accused him of loving intellectual anarchy and preferring a wolf world, absolutely unpent and wild. And that's essentially how he comes across. But he tries to defend it. And he responds to a question that he received saying, is a pragmatist necessarily a complete materialist and agnostic? And the answer is yes. Now he doesn't end up giving an answer. He skirts the question, but it's a good criticism somebody gives to him. It seems to me, somebody wrote to him, that the pragmatic objection to pragmatism lies in the fact that it might accentuate the narrowness of narrow minds. He only relates meaning in life to whatever has consequences for our life. He gives a condescending attitude towards anybody that would have belief in what he calls an absolute. And he dismisses such a belief. But others have during the time that he did these lectures, he had other people that called him on the mat for some of his essays that he wrote. And he even admitted that they were clever. He wrote an essay called The Will to Believe, which was essentially an essay about the will not to believe. And some of his detractors said, you might as well have called it The Will to Deceive or The Will to Make Believe. And he says these were wittily proposed as substitutes for it. And he's unable to defend those criticisms, although I have to give him credit that he did mention them, that people during his day did criticize his beliefs, because people during his day did recognize that his beliefs led to things like agnosticism, atheism, and to put it as they said, was the will not to believe and the will to deceive, which is what his philosophy ends up producing. When there is no absolute, when there is nothing to be responsible towards, then what happens to humans as a result? They say, oh, well, whatever's expedient, whatever works at this time, that allows them to justify any action. And we see that happening to this day. To this day, it comes out in the words of Stephen Krauss and Richard Dawkins, where they're actively and openly using all their efforts to destroy religion because they feel it's not scientific enough for them. But essentially, the reason why they want to destroy religion is because it suggests to them the idea of being responsible to a creator. And even such an idea is so vehemently, they are so vehemently opposed to such a concept that they will do everything in their power to unshackle themselves from such a concept. And the way they do that is by denying any existence of any absolute. They don't even want to use the term God. They say, oh, there's no absolute. It's just whatever's expedient, whatever works for the moment. If you have to do something and you have to lie, cheat, steal, or deceive to get what you want, and it's expedient, it meets their requirement of what expedience is, it meets their definition of what good is, then for them it's fine. Because there is no absolute, nor are there any individual absolutes down the chain of command, so to speak. This is what atheistic thinking leads to. And this gentleman was one of the initial proponents of this form of atheistic thinking, even though you can see it's still only in its infancy, and even though the morals and attitudes of the day prevented him from being a whole-scale proponent of atheism, it's not hard to detect in between the lines of his writing, which is a writing that derides religion and attempts to reject outright any ideas relating to a concept of an absolute or any ideas relating to a creator. I wish I could talk more, but my time is up. I'm sorry for the pain of having to go through these details with you. I hope you're able to double speed this video so that you can get through it, put it on the shelf, and not have to deal with it again. We are making good progress. That's the only good thing I can say. Bear with me. We're almost halfway through the book, and I'm going to get through it as quick as I can. I promise I'll try and make my next videos more concise, faster, and more to the point. But I wanted to try and go through as many notes as I could on these lectures so that it would hopefully make sense to you. Thank you for watching. God bless you. I love you very much. I know that God loves you too. Talk to you soon.